So welcome again. We're in week about 4 of our series in the Pentateuch, and so we've moved out of Genesis and we're in Exodus now, and we're going to spend a couple weeks here. But the Pentateuch is the first 5 books of the Old Testament, and what we've realized is the story of God described in the Old Testament in the Pentateuch has a lot of teaching moments for us as God's people today. The story of God in the Old Testament becomes very relevant for us in our story in the modern, with God's modern people. So that's why we're in the Pentateuch for a couple of weeks. So we're in Exodus this week, and our theme is exile. Exile isn't a word we normally use, right? I can't tell you if, I don't think I've used that in a sentence this past couple of weeks. But for us, exile still exists. But exile has never looked so cool. You guys hear me? I got a picture of it. Exile looks like this. Hashtag van life, any of you? Right? There's been like a movement kind of pressed by minimalism, right? Kind of sell everything you have and that doesn't bring joy to your life. The Marie Kondo of our modern age on Netflix. My wife watched the show a few times. She's like, this is really helpful and good, but I kind of feel weird saying thank you to the things I'm getting rid of. But that's okay, right? But Marie Kondo, minimalism, if you're not familiar with it, it's basically anything that doesn't bring joy to your life, to get rid of it. So clothes, clutter, I mean, just kind of, you can kind of start to take account all the things in your house that you don't use. But it's a cool idea, but it's kind of morphed in this idea of van life. And exile has become hip, right? Because the van life, you don't have a home. Your home is on wheels. You're moving. It's mobile. People are desiring tiny homes and kind of shrinking down their living spaces. In San Diego, it's kind of necessary, though, right? It's like $50,000 to rent a house every day. It's ridiculous. The housing in San Diego is incredibly high. My dad's a realtor, and I get to kind of see the houses that he's showing people and selling, and it's insane. So in San Diego, we have a massive housing crisis. People without homes living in San Diego. There's no way to afford property or even to rent and live like a normal life on a regular salary. And so van life seems kind of appealing, honestly, right? I don't have to pay rent, no utilities, right? You get like a gym membership, you have a shower and a sink. I mean, it sounds pretty awesome. The Instagram account for the Van Life Diaries has almost 1 million followers. Like, people are buying into this. It's a normal thing. If you search on Instagram the hashtag van life, over 1 million photos, I mean, I think it's like 4 million photos pop up with that hashtag. And I stumbled across a video a while ago of a guy named Daniel Norris, and the video was titled, "The Millionaire Pitcher That Lives in a Van." That's a great title, right? And this guy signed a multi-million-dollar contract to pitch for the Jays, and he decided to live in his 1978 air-cooled V-dub Vanagon. That's legit. I'm in on that. This is kind of a grassroots movement, but it's gained some serious momentum, and for good reason. There's so much freedom involved. Like, if you don't have a home, you don't have the overhead. You kind of have a luxury to move and go wherever your heart pleases. You can travel. You can go cross country, all over the place because you have a car instead of a home. I would love to try to start the van life, hashtag Sherwood Van Life. But for the sake of my family, I don't think that would be the healthiest decision. The past couple of days, I am tired. I'll just be honest with you, I'm tired. Past couple of days, the girls have woken up at like 3 a.m. There's like 2-3 a.m.s in a row, and then today was like 4 or 5. I don't even know what time it was when we woke up. But we put both girls together, so my 9-month-old Rosemary, we'll call her Romy, she was crying in the crib, and then like once she woke Ellie up, Ellie just started yelling, "No!" So it was like every time Rosemary cried, Ellie would yell, "No!" It was like, man, no. It's like this back and forth. Oh, man. It would be amazing to live in a van, but I think Dad would exile a few of the girls out of the van. It wouldn't be a healthy decision for us. Oh, man. So exile has become a choice for some people. Living in a van, it's like this ultimate dream for some of us young people. There's someone here, she's not here today, but she has a tattoo of a Vanagon, right? Like, it's the mentality, it's the freedom mentality, the van life way of being. But there's also an exile that's not a choice. I don't know if you're well aware of the Venezuelan crisis right now. The economy is just plummeted, the government is in shambles, and there's a massive amount of people moving out into Latin America, Mexico, and looking for asylum in the US. What about the Syrians, still a war-torn country, millions of people flooding out of their country, Syria, to find home? I mean, for us, we understand that exile, although it might be an ancient cry of God's people in Exodus in the Old Testament, it is still a modern reality. Exile, whether by choice or not by choice, is still a reality for modern people. So the Israelites in Exodus, we're going to be in chapter 12 through 14, looking at some of the history of Israel in exile. They were forced to do the hashtag horse and wagon life back in the day. That was like the OG minimalists, the OG van lifers, because they were nomads. They were wanderers, right? They had no home. And this was the description of God's people throughout the Old Testament. If you look at going from Genesis through the rest of the Old Testament, they were kicked out of the garden. They were exiled out of the garden. The home, the place that God had created for them, was no longer home and a place of safety. The description of Cain wandering the desert and God's people following in that way of life. Abraham and his family lived in tents. So from Abraham and the rest of his descendants wandered in the desert. They were a nomadic tribe. They had no home. And I think the most profound summation of Exodus comes from the theologian Bob Marley, who said, Exodus, movement of Jah people, right? That's what exile is, right? It's a movement of God's people from one place to another. They don't have a home. There's no place of safety. There's no place of rest. And that was what described God's people in the Old Testament. And I'll make the case this morning that that might be the best posture for us as modern followers of Jesus, a people of exile. So we're going to start in chapter 12, verse 37, to get a good context, a good background of the story that's happening. Verse 37. The Israelites journeyed from Ramses to Succoth. There were about 600,000 men on foot, besides women and children. Many other people went up with them, and also large droves of livestock, both flocks and herds. With the dough the Israelites had brought from Egypt, they baked loaves of unleavened bread. The dough was without yeast because they had been driven out of Egypt and did not have time to prepare food for themselves. Now the length of time the Israelite people lived in Egypt was 430 years. At the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. So in one movement, you have all of God's people after 430 years in Egypt, in slavery, in bondage to the oppressor. They're leaving Egypt out of slavery to freedom. I don't know if you noticed the urgency, though. It talks about their bread, and they've put it over their shoulders on kneading cloths, and they were moving out of Egypt, and there was such urgency that they didn't have time to let the bread be filled with leaven. Any of you guys bake bread out there? We got a couple, so we got some bakers out there, right? But leaven is like the good stuff of bread, you know? That's the best part of it, because it makes it rise, it gets all fluffy inside and it aerates the bread, and it just becomes so good. They didn't have time for that. This is like the gluten-free version, but it was because they needed to get out real fast. So they grabbed their bread. There's this sense of urgency, like we need to get out of Egypt now before Pharaoh changes his mind. We need to get out before he decides to kill us instead. And so this massive amount of people are moving out of Egypt towards freedom. The Passover in Jewish tradition becomes a celebration of this movement of God's people from Egypt as slaves to the desert as free people. So they have Passover, and Jews still celebrate this. The Passover, or the Feast of Unleavened Bread, is a celebration of God's movement to free his people from Egypt. What you also see here in this passage, though, is a deep willingness of the people to follow God out of Egypt. You see the descriptions in this passage that there were droves of livestock. That's hard work to herd animals and keep them in line. There's a bunch of people all gathering together, moving their belongings out. And all of this was to prepare for themselves as the journey that would be towards freedom. But there's a willingness on the part of God's people to accept this new fate and to move in step with God out of what was familiar. I mean, if you think about it, they were leaving everything behind. Everything. All their old ways of life and frameworks, what they had lived in for 430 years. This is generational. These people don't know anything different. They're leaving Egypt. They're leaving their neighbors, their watering holes, their wells. They're leaving their homes that they had built with their own hands. They're leaving everything in this one moment. I want us to realize this for a second, that God is calling his people out of slavery to freedom, but it takes leaving their former residence to step into that freedom. I don't know if you hear that this morning. It was a complete change of life, going from the slavery they had understood and known and lived in, and that was their own reality in Egypt. It took leaving everything behind and moving towards a new life. Freedom for Israel meant leaving what was familiar and attaining to what wasn't. And God was calling them in this moment to leave everything to gain their freedom. There's a story of Abraham Lincoln that I think beautifully describes this. And I don't know if this story is real. It might be folklore, but it's a beautiful and poetic description of this moment between Abraham Lincoln and this slave girl. So I'm going to read it to you. There's an old story that Abraham Lincoln went down to the slave block to buy a slave girl. As she looked at the white man bidding on her, she figured he was another white man going to buy her and then abuse her. He won the bid, and as he was walking away with his property, listen to that dehumanizing language, he said, "Young lady, you are free." I want you to listen to her response. She said, "What does that mean?" "It means you're free." "Does that mean," she said, that I can say whatever I want to say?" Lincoln said, "Yes, my dear, you can say whatever you want to say." "Does that mean," she said, "that I can be whatever I want to be?" And Lincoln said, "Yes, you can be whatever you want to be." "Does that mean I can go wherever I want to go?" And he said, "Yes, you can go wherever you want to go." And the girl, with tears streaming down her face, said, "Then I will go with you." I can picture in this moment in the Israelites' mind, the existence of slavery that had just tattered their humanity. They were beaten down. They were working for the oppressor, building buildings, doing whatever. They were gathering hay and mud and making bricks. And in this one moment, God calls them to freedom. There's a sense of urgency to jump into God's call into freedom. And there is a willingness of the people to go. They're saying, "You know what? You're setting us free, then I will go with you, Lord." Without being too cliche this morning, I'm a dad and I've already said 2 bad jokes, so it's fine. It's whatever, I'll just go for it. There's some of you who have felt the weight of slavery. In religious language, we call this sin, and that sin has separated you from freedom in God. And see, what God is doing it through Jesus is he's saying, "Come to me if you're weary and burdened, I'll give you rest. My yoke is easy, my burden is light." That the slavery that you're living in isn't what I would desire for you. And God is asking you, do you want freedom? I mean, it's an invitation for you. Everything that you've succumbed to, your evil, your bad habits, your hurtful relationships, the way you deny people relationship and love and experience, God is saying, give those things up. But in order to walk from slavery to freedom, you're going to have to give up everything. That's your life included. And so it's interesting to see this narrative of Scripture in Exodus of God's people moving from an existence in slavery, leaving everything behind to grasp onto the way of God. And if you notice, it's like they couldn't take anything excessive. There was like the clothes on their backs, their kids, they couldn't leave them behind, although it would be really easy. That was a bad joke again. But it's like you just took everything that was necessary, and God's asking you, what is necessary? Leave all of those things behind that are keeping you from fulfilling my desires for you, keeping you from flourishing in this life. Moving from slavery to freedom, although sounds beautiful, is a difficult thing for all of us to do, but the invitation is for you this morning. Jesus says, do you want to be free? For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Continuing on in the story, in chapter 14, verses 5 through 9. This is when the rubber meets the road. It starts to get a little crazy. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariots made ready and took his army with him. He took 600 of the best chariots along with all the other chariots of Egypt, with officers over all of them. The Lord hardened the heart of the Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. The Egyptians, all Pharaoh's horses and chariots and horsemen and troops, pursued the Israelites, overtook them as they camped by the sea near Pi-Hahiroth, opposite Baal-Zephon. Oh no. Pharaoh changes his mind. And you notice the reason why, right? This seems pretty obvious. It's like, Pharaoh, we've lost all our services. Because they had lost their slaves. They're realizing that all the responsibilities that Israel had done on their behalf was now the Egyptians' responsibilities. Now they were obligated to shepherd, feed, and care for their livestock. Now they needed to bring up water from the Nile. They needed to prepare their own food. They needed to put on their own eyeliner and mascara. I feel like every depiction of Egyptians in the movies, they always have eyeliner on. Is that just a thing? Whatever they used to do, the ancient Egyptians needed, they now lost that life of luxury. The Egyptians' way of living was now over, and they were now responsible for partaking in whatever the Israelites had done. So the armies that Pharaoh rounded up weren't necessarily going to slaughter the Israelites. As we see later in the story, they're kind of fearful for their own life. The armies weren't necessarily going to kill them. They were going to round them up and bring them back. They needed slaves. They were like, we need you to do our work for us. The second thing, though, that we realize is the Israelites were marching out with boldness. I don't know if you saw that in verse 8. The Lord hardened the heart of Pharaoh, king of Egypt, so that he pursued the Israelites who were marching out boldly. Marching out boldly. And that depiction of Israel is so beautiful. Why? Because the modern readers, we often get down on Israel for grumbling and complaining and being dumb. And all through the narrative, we see this throughout. Israel denies God in a lot of ways. But in this moment, they're celebrating the victory that was given to them by God. They had moved from slaves to freedom. And in this moment, they were walking out boldly, like chest puffed up and chin high. In this moment, it was glorious for them because they were free. Generations upon generations of families struck with oppression was now over. I would have walked out Egypt in the same way. And on top of that, in Exodus 12, it reads, the Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them whatever they asked for. Basically, what we're saying is they were free and they were wealthy. They were rich. They had taken whatever they could out of Egypt to prepare for their future in the desert or where God was calling them. See, God had told Israel to get prepared for the Exodus, and so they had grabbed all the livestock and the gold and silver, and they were free and they were provided for. But what I think is important for us to realize, though, is the boldness didn't come from the Israelites' material wealth. The Israelites were not walking out because they had like chandeliers in their trailers or something. The Israelites were not bold because they thought that they could defeat Egypt if they came, because we're going to see in a few minutes that's not the case. They had no military power to defend themselves against Egypt. Why were the Israelites bold? They were bold because they understood that God was the one who was working on their behalf. Their movement from slavery to freedom was by nothing that they had done, but it was a complete miracle and action of God alone. So they were walking out in boldness. Why? Because they trusted God. They said, you moved us out from 430 years of slavery. We're going to be bold for you because you've worked on our behalf. And oh, how quickly that faded. The Israelites succumbed to terror in the next couple of verses. Pick it up in verse 10. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. Oh no. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die? What have you done to us by bringing us out of Egypt? Didn't we say to you in Egypt, leave us alone, let us serve the Egyptians? It would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than to die in the desert. Moses answered the people, do not be afraid, stand firm, and you will see the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see today you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only to be still. I can imagine the Israelites just hearts sank to the pit of their stomachs. Right? They were just rejoicing. They were free. They were walking in boldness because God had acted on their behalf. I mean, it's just been, the shackles were removed. It was a new way of living. And in this one moment, they look up and they can see the dust clouds in the distance. Maybe the glistening of the armor. Maybe the sounds of the horses tramping towards them. The oppressor was on his way back. And their hearts just sank. They were full of terror. I want you to picture this, though, because in this moment, in the geography, their back was to a massive place of water, body of water. There was no going that way, and the Egyptians were coming this way. They were trapped. There was nowhere to go. And if you remember correctly, Egypt had just endured 10 plagues. You remember the 10 plagues? This was like the Sunday school lesson if you could memorize all of them. Water to blood, frogs, lice, flies, diseased livestock, boils, thunderstorm of hail and fire, locusts, 3 days of darkness, and then the last one stripped Egypt of their eldest child. See, this army was full of men, not who were just under orders of Pharaoh the king, but were resentful and bitter towards God's people. For they were the ones that had brought on all of this pain and suffering. It's no wonder Israel stooped in despair. I think the Israelites are complete buzzkills, though. Did you hear those questions they were telling Moses? It would have been better to be slaves in Egypt than to die free in the desert. I've realized that every great blockbuster movie disagrees with that mindset. I don't know if you guys are familiar with Braveheart, Mel Gibbs. What's his most famous line? I was going to try this guy's accent, but I'm not going to. I'm just going to say it to you, right? And tell our enemies that they can take our lives, but they'll never take our freedom. Right? There's like painted face in blue, and it's just like this total bro pump-up moment, and they all rush out to fight and battle this army that's way bigger than themselves. The Israel mindset is complete opposite. Did you hear the Israelites? Tell the Egyptians that they can take our freedom, but they'll never take our lives. And they're like, take us back to slavery. Let's go. It's a total buzzkill. I would have been like, yeah, wait a second. That's not how the line goes. We're supposed to get, they didn't understand. See, this is the problem. Despair inhabits a people with a lack of vision. They are terrified because they cannot see the full story that God has brought over them. They're in terror to lose their lives because they don't understand what they've gained in following Yahweh and following God. Despair, terror, fear, anger, and habits of people that lack the ability to see God's movement in the story. Because this whole plan is really puzzling. I don't know if you guys realize this, but this whole story seems pretty unfortunate. Israel is free after 430 years of slavery, and in one miscue, they find themselves trapped by their old slave owners. In one fell swoop, we see them celebrating their freedom to despair because of the oncoming army that has trapped them with no way out. Whose idea was this? I would have been looking around trying to point a finger like, Moses, was this your idea, bro? Was this your plan to bring us out of Egypt to this place? And Moses would have been like looking around, it wasn't my idea. I mean, have you ever played Risk? This is like strategy 101. Don't trap yourself. I mean, that's even a board game rule. Don't trap yourself. And Moses would have looked at them and looked at me and said, it wasn't my idea. So if we step back a few verses in chapter 14, verses 1 through 3, we get a full picture of the story. Then the Lord said to Moses, who said to Moses? It was the Lord. Tell the Israelites to turn back and encamp near Pi-Hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. They are to encamp by the sea directly opposite Baal-Zephon. Pharaoh will think the Israelites are wandering around the land in confusion, hemmed in by the desert. Whose idea was this? It was God's idea to be trapped between a brutal army that wants to enslave them and a massive body of water. It was God's idea for them to be cornered. It wasn't Moses's. And I love it because God uses Israel as almost bait. He's like, no, you guys camp here and act confused. Strike that. Just camp here and act yourself. Pharaoh's going to think like something's wrong. You guys are stuck. I'm going to use you to draw in the enemy. And what's interesting, though, is I love, because oftentimes we think that we're arbiters of God's plan, but sometimes God uses us to fulfill his story. And so in this moment, you see God using Israel, not as instruments of his plan, but as pieces, as pawns, as God is moving to free people and bring his beauty and flourishing to the world. In this one moment, he uses his people as bait. But what was the point? Why did God trap his people? There's a rift throughout this chapter. There's a pulse at the heart of this chapter that I really want you to see. In verse 4, it says, and I will harden, this is God speaking to Moses, and I will harden Pharaoh's heart, and he will pursue them. But I will gain glory for myself through Pharaoh and all his armies, and the Egyptians will know that I am the Lord. So the Israelites did this. Why was God doing this? So that he would be known and glorified. That in the story, it would not be Moses who triumphs. It would not be Pharaoh, the king, who triumphs with his massive army and beautiful chariots and horses. It would be God who triumphed in the story. Again, verse 18, we get another glimmer of this. The Egyptians will know that I am the Lord when I gain glory through Pharaoh, his chariots, and his horsemen. See, God was using his people to reveal to everyone around them that he was great and glorious, that no one in Israelite could bring freedom apart from God himself. It was God's desire to be known and glorified. And the ensuing verses tell of Israel's safety. There was a pillar of smoke and fire that came as a curtain between God's people and Egypt. And then, of course, the famous story is Moses raises his hand out in the water and divides the water. And there's these two massive walls of water that the people walk through. And Egypt follows and ensues, and the waters fall and crush God's enemies. And we find ourselves at the end of chapter 14 with this in verse 31. And when the Israelites saw the mighty hand of the Lord displayed against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord and put their trust in him and in Moses, his servant. You see that? What was the point of the story? It was to call everyone who was witnessing to a place of trust in God, that he was the one orchestrating the story. He was the one in charge of the narrative. It was no one else but apart from God that brought them freedom out of Egypt and saved them from their enemies. God was known by his people, and they put their trust in him. I think for us, exile is not something we normally would ascribe to ourselves. But I want to make the case this morning, and I want to step back from the biblical text for a few minutes to say this. The exile that was on God's people, the exile that they experienced, not having a home, living a nomadic life, going from town to town and wandering in the desert, that exile is the best posture of God's people today. I want to outline a few things in history. The modern church's engagement with the modern world has been characterized by two things. Any of you biology people? You like biology? Nobody? Okay, sorry. No one went to school. I got like a okay kind of. But biology, there's the fight or flight, the flight or fight, right? So when you come up to something difficult, there's two things you can do. You can run for the hills. I'm in on that one. Anyone else? No? You're not willing to admit it? Okay, I see how it is. Or there's fight, right? Like battle and overpower the trouble. What we see in the church's life, especially with our engagement with the world around us, so your neighbors, the grocery store clerks, your friends who are far from God, the way we vote in our part of politics in our modern culture, we've really responded in two ways. There's either flight or fight. In the 40s, after World War II, we see the church in the flight stage. This was around when Scopes trials was going on. This was when a biology teacher was teaching evolution in their own classroom. And they won, and obviously it shaped the way our classrooms are set now. And evolution is taught widely. And so in that moment, you have the church removing itself from the public sphere. It's almost like out of fear or anger or resentment, they removed themselves from culture and kind of like became this like in solidarity with themselves and removed themselves out of the modern conversations. J.P. Moreland would call this moment in history when the culture became saltless. As you have that passage in the New Testament, God calls his people to be a salt and a light to the earth, preserving and bringing truth as like salt does to meat and preserving the food. We would also have that same character on culture. But we were removed from the public sphere. The church became isolated, and Christian ideas and practices moved from the center to the margins of culture. At this point in San Diego, we really understand this problem. 3 to 4% of people attend church on Sunday in San Diego. It's one of the least church cities in the U.S. And our city is not generally hostile to Jesus and this good news, but it's become trivial. People are like, why do you follow Jesus? What's the point of your sexual ethic? Why do you read the Bible? What's the point of praying? And the way of Jesus has become trivial to people. The second idea is fight. So throughout the 40s, maybe up to mid-70s, the church did the same thing. And so my iPad is freaking out. Oh, there we go. We're good. But you have the church going from the margins after they had left culture and kind of raging back into the scene. There was a newspaper article in Newsweek in 1978 that was called Born Again. I have a picture of it. And it was like, in this moment, I need to find a shirt with that collar. Come on now, right? That is awesome. But in this moment, the church moved from the margins after being separated for so long, and they rushed back in to modern culture. And so Newsweek picks up on this. It's like the 1978 was the year of the evangelicals. It was like this year that everyone came streaming back in. You have people running for office and getting and like being more involved in politics and decisions. And I was like, this was after the sexual revolution of the 60s, when Roe v. Wade happened and abortion became legal and the gay community began its campaign. That was when the church came roaring back onto the scene. But it would seem like the difference between flight and fight doesn't come in the position that we were in. So I think both the church in flight and fight carried the same frustration and anger that it did in both cases. So our modern experience of church in the modern culture is one of two things: to flee, to run, out of fear, out of frustration for being characterized as Christians in the modern space. And the other thing we do is we fight. So what happens in that case is we roar back into the scene and we try and oppress people, we try and exert power, and we try and change culture by influence. But I would say this: the church both in flight and the church both in fight carry the same foundational problems. It's driven by fear, it's driven by anxiety, and it's driven by anger. And so you have the church infiltrating modern culture with this underlying frustration that the world is slipping away, and we now desperately need to change things. Like if we don't move, then everything's going to go to shambles. Henry Nouwen said this, I think that was really poignant. Fear endangers fear. It never gives birth to love. And I think he's riffing off Paul in the descriptions in the New Testament where it says that like there is no fear in love, yet perfect love casts out fear. So I want to ask you this morning, have you felt the weight of angry neighbors towards your biblical worldview? Have you felt maybe in like a classroom setting, whether in high school or college, the demeaning eyes of a biology teacher as he talks about evolution and you raise your hand and he's like, oh great, you're one of those Christians. Like, have you felt the weight of the world that's changing and shifting around you? Have you been yelled at by someone because you voted for someone different than they did? Has someone like angrily approached you because you don't agree with their sexual ethic or orientation? What I'm trying to say this morning is all of us, have been placed up front with the world that's changing and moving away from Jesus. In kind of academic circles, we talk about postmodernism or post-Christendom. Like the place the church held in modern culture has shifted, and it's no longer at the center of culture. It's at the margins. And so the question is, how do we respond? And from this story of the Israelites in exile, I think we can glean a lot of things from their posture. For one, the ancient Israelites, they didn't have a home. They left their home and were placed in exile. And so what we see about them is they were displaced. They didn't have a comfortable position to be in. They didn't have a home that was cozy and warm. They didn't have neighbors or friends that they would see every day as they go to the grocery store. They didn't have a place to call home. And in the same way, Christians today, we also have been displaced. And what that means is that we are also in exile. We don't have a home. There's a passage in Hebrews chapter 13 or chapter 11 that says, we are longing for a better country. We're looking for a city that lasts forever. And so in the same way as Israel moved out of Egypt from slavery to freedom, we too have left culture in a similar way, out of slavery, out of becoming like culture, to displaying the truth of Jesus, moving into freedom, but we're still in exile, we're displaced. We don't have a home. And the moment we become comfortable in this culture, the moment we become comfortable in this world, is a moment we've probably assimilated. And I want to be careful here, because often what our next step is to say is that, oh, my hope is in heaven. And that means I'm just going to flee from the anxiety and angers and pressures of this world. But God's called you to something more profound and deeper than that. He's called you to act in boldness. I mean, picture the Israelites walking out of Egypt with their heads held high and their chests puffed. This was before they saw the army, before they had just succumbed to terror. They were emboldened because God had acted on their behalf. You as well, if you're followers of Jesus, have been moved from slavery to freedom. And you get to walk boldly in this life. There is no frustration or anger because there's nothing anyone can do to you. because you've been made free in Jesus. God has acted on your behalf, and as Paul would proclaim in the New Testament, you've moved from death to life. You've moved from slavery to freedom. You've entered into this walk with Jesus where his burden is light and his yoke is easy. I think for many of us, though, our attitude is still of despair. I mean, you see these movements of the exile in Egypt, movement of God's people from slavery to freedom, displaced from their home. They were emboldened, but they had this fullness of despair come on them when they saw the army coming. And what happens to us as a people in this modern environment, when we despair, when we're struck with terror, when our frustrations and anger overcome us, and that describes the way we respond to people in this modern culture who are not following Jesus, what we realize is that we are also a people who lack vision and trust in God. What's the full story? As Jesus prays with his disciples, he says this, "Kingdom come on earth as it is in heaven." See, the full story is that God will renew all things. And then as pressured and as frustrated as you might feel, if we set to despair and are full of anger and frustration, what we've done is we've become like Israel, terrified after God had freed us from slavery. And we lack vision for the future, and we lack an inspiration of God to say, the kingdom will come on earth as it is in heaven. Do you trust that that will happen? See, we've become so afraid of what the culture will do to us. Are you afraid of losing some religious liberty? Do you think that will stop or halt God's movement in this world? If we look at places like China, where people aren't even allowed to meet together, there's a church plant here in San Diego who's partnering with a church in China, and all of its leaders were arrested because they're trying to take all of these churches who are gospel, beautiful Jesus churches to assimilate to the church, the state of in China. And so they arrested all of these church leaders. They arrested and interviewed all of the congregants. And I would say to you that in that moment, that church became more stronger and of a witness of Jesus than it was before. Are you afraid of someone taking your religious liberty? God's kingdom will not stop if we're in cuffs. What are you afraid of? Are you afraid of them taking away our sacred scripture, making it illegal to read the Bible? Do you think that will stop God's kingdom from coming? We're a part of the Christian and Missionary Alliance, and there's missionaries in parts of the world that I can't tell you what country they're in because it'll be unsafe for them. And you know what they do? They memorize whole books of the Bible before they go into the country. And it's just saturated in their mind and their brain, and they go up to people and they recite to them the beautiful word of God. Do you think if they take the Bible away from us, God's kingdom would halt? All throughout the ages, Christians and even today are dying for their faith. I mean, are we afraid in America that we'll lose our lives? Would God's kingdom stop if we lost our lives? I mean, that's the great claim of Christianity. In the ancient world, when the Rome was suppressing and killing Christians, there was this bishop that said, "The more I kill, the more spring up." The Christian's blood is the seed. And it's like, what are we afraid of? And so our attitudes, is our pursuit of the people around us characterized by frustration, fear, and anger? That's not the way of Jesus. God is calling you to accept his way of humility and submission, where we would be a people not frustrated and angry, but a people of incarnation. So this is this religious word. There has to be another way. We can't run from it because we've been called to it, and we can't fight it because we haven't been called to oppress or overpower it. We've been called to be like Jesus, to be incarnational. See, Jesus was displaced too. He left his home. He left the throne in heaven to dwell among his people. Jesus was in exile too. And he humbly submitted himself, which means that he was with people who were far from God, people who would anger us and frustrate us, but he submitted and he listened. And in creating those relationships and bonds, Jesus began to shape people. He started with 12. That 12 went out to 72. That 72 grew and it grew and it grew. And the grass movements of Jesus is what we're a part of today. And God is calling us into that same way. One more passage before we close. I just wanted to read this quickly. This is in Jeremiah 29. And I would love to spend some more time here, but we'll come back to this eventually. This was written to God's people in exile. So Israel was placed in exile. They kind of grew. They had some kings. They established a kingdom. They fell away from God and were completely destroyed and went back into exile. And so this was written, Jeremiah is this prophet who's writing to God's people who are in exile again. And he writes this, starting in verse 4. This is what the Lord Almighty, the God of Israel, says to all those I carried into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and settle down. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry and have sons, and daughters. Find wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage so that they too may have sons and daughters. Increase in number there, do not decrease. And I want you to listen carefully. Also seek the peace and the prosperity of the city to which I have carried you into exile. Pray to the Lord for it, because if it prospers, you too will prosper. See, our future in this city is deeply knit to the outcomes that it produces. We're called to be faithful people of Jesus, pursuing people not in frustration or anger or bitterness, but called to pursue people in love. I mean, this is the mission of God, that you would now be the hands and feet of Jesus. And see, we've removed ourselves from the conversations. We've been more appealing to politics than to people. We've been appealing to more of self protection than the protection of others. But Jesus is inviting you to a different way, to love, to pursue, to submit to the people around you. And that's how mission starts. That's how transformation comes. Not by power and oppression, but by a people who are willing to submit to the way of Jesus. For those of you who feel oppressed, for those of you who feel endangered by a system that is broken, can I just encourage you this morning and say that Jesus has a beautiful path for you? For those of you who feel heavy this morning, who your hearts are broken by something that's happening in your life, can we just reminisce on the moment that you became free? That moment that God took you from slavery to freedom. And can we be empowered by those situations to invite other people into that we would see more and more people move from slavery to freedom in this culture that has denied Jesus and his truth. And that we would be a people of love, of service, of submission, and that we would seek the prosperity of this city that we live in. Why don't you stand with me as we close? Just as a way of closing, I wanted to pray this blessing over us. This prayer comes from St. Francis. And I want you to be aware of the language that's being used and the way of life that I think is beautiful in this. So let me read it over us. Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light, and where there is sadness, joy. O divine Master, grant that I may not so much seek to be consoled as to console, to be understood as to understand, to be loved as to love. For it is in giving that we receive. It is in pardoning that we are pardoned, and it is in dying that we are born to eternal life. Amen.